Okay, I got it. I do want to leave time for discussion because I think I'm certainly extremely interested in how a group of citizens like yourselves who have a concern about this issue react to these arguments. And I think I would like to be sure that we have plenty of time for you to ask questions or express your own reactions to what John and I came up with. So I'm going to share screen.
Good.
Does that work?
Yep.
Okay.
He's got a slide up.
He's got what?
Oh.
Okay, so here's some key ideas, some of which may be unfamiliar to you. The first one is that, in fact, there isn't really, in the correct economic sense, a burden of mitigating climate change. It's better to understand it as a net benefit to the world economy. A second point is to support this is the analysis that the benefits of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions are so large that everyone can share in them, provided they are well distributed across the world's population and across generations. We'll discuss those points in some more detail. Those are sometimes intuitively difficult for people to grasp, but I hope I can give you an idea of just why it is that economic analysis tells us that there is no economic cost, that is no opportunity cost to mitigating climate change. Distributing these benefits will require a new financial institution, which will also mobilize financial resources to implement the investment needed for decarbonizing the world economy. And the purpose of the overall paper was to give the rationale for this policy and the particular institution of this world, what we call World Climate Bank. This is a little background. Most of the discussion of climate change refers to a burden. And so we wanted to introduce some of these ideas as a background to the way that we're thinking about it. For example, this is the Stern Review on the economics of climate change. What we do now can have only a limited effect on the climate over the next 40 or 50 years. This, incidentally, is a point that doesn't seem to be very well understood, that just as climate change itself is a very relatively long horizon phenomenon, so control of climate change is going to be. On the other hand, what we do in the next 10 or 20 years can have a profound effect on the climate in the second half of this century and in the next. Mitigation, taking strong action to reduce emissions, must be viewed as an investment, a cost incurred now and in the coming few decades to avoid the risks of very severe consequences in the future. The problem with this is the word cost. It's not necessarily a cost that's incurred now in the opportunity cost sense. Stern recommends the present generation of people to incur costs now and in the coming few decades to avoid the risks of very severe consequences in the future. John and I ask, why should we do so? And our answer is that the explanation is morality. Stern is implicitly appealing to our moral responsibility. Indeed, the UN process has always been implicitly making the same moral appeal. The only reason we have to accept the burden for the sake of future generations is a moral one. Is this moral appeal justified? Well, we think it is. Do we really have a moral responsibility to make the lives of future people better? John is perhaps one of the world's biggest experts on the morality derived from utilitarian reasoning. First, we arguably have a general moral duty to improve the lives of others, and this will include the lives of future people. The benefits we can bring to others must be balanced against the burden on us, but if the benefit is large and the burden small, we should accept it. In fact, we're going to argue that the burden is not small. It can be made negative with appropriate policies. At least that is one plausible view, but not everyone accepts that we have this general duty to promote other people's good. However, in the case of climate change, there's an especially pressing moral consideration. Controlling climate change is a matter of correcting damage that we are already doing. In other words, it's a question of something that we're actually doing, namely driving our cars to the mall and heating our houses and cooling them with fossil fuel energy. Through climate change, our emissions of greenhouse gas are making future lives worse than they would otherwise have been. This is a moral wrong. We should not do it. We have a clear moral duty to reduce the damage we do. This is basically behind the UN advocacy and also, for example, Greta Thunberg. I left the slide out about Greta Thunberg, but however, the moral appeal, and this is an important point of transition in our argument, the moral appeal has not proved powerful enough to bring climate change under control. After 30 years, global emissions of greenhouse gas are still rising, apart from a reduction temporarily caused by COVID-19. The appeal has failed. True, many individuals are moved by morality. Actually, this is not just 30 years. I once went to a seminar at Columbia University in an engineering department in the 1990s, where the speaker said, you know, if you look at the textbooks on the engineering of internal combustion engines, the issue of climate change was quite well understood in the 1940s and 1950s. It's clearly become more of a headline issue, but it's been around for a very long time. Well, we do follow the moral imperative. Some of us make sacrifices for the sake of future people. We insulate houses, eat less meat, reduce our travel, and so on. However, many of us continue to act self-interestedly without weighing the consequences of our action on future generations. Individual morality is not sufficient to solve the problem of climate change, not just because not enough people will do as morality requires, but because individual actions must be coordinated to have their intended effect. This is an aspect of economics that I'm particularly interested in, is the problem of coordination of social action. For example, to reduce our emissions substantially, we need big changes in our economic infrastructure, and as individuals, we cannot make those changes. To solve the problem of climate change, governments need to act. They cannot leave the responsibility to individuals. Governments have the coercive power through regulation and taxes to make sure that everyone, not just those who are morally motivated, responds to climate change, and to coordinate individual responses to achieve real impact. The problem is, so now we shift gears to think a little bit more about the politics of climate change, of decarbonization. The problem is that many governments seem impervious to morality, or at least to be insufficiently moved by it, to overcome the paralysis induced by political conflicts over the impact of climate policies. The far-seeing economist A.C. Pigou wrote in 1920, "The state should protect the interests of the future in some degree against the effect of our preferences for ourselves over our descendants. It is the clear duty of government, which is the trustee for unborn generations, as well as for its present citizens, to watch over and defend the exhaustible natural resources of the country from rash and reckless speculation." But now the shoe is apparently on the other foot. It seems to be governments that do not care about unborn generations when their citizens do, or at least find themselves unable to act effectively. Governments, in our view, my view, this is maybe particularly, are more willing to promise action on climate change than to perform it. And therefore, a lot of my reading of government policy is that it is what you'd call political theater more than actual action. Virtually every government in the world approved the Paris Agreement of 2015, which said this agreement aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. In support of the agreement, countries made pledges to the United Nations to reduce their emissions. But even these pledges taken together are not enough to meet the 2 degrees C target, let alone the 1.5 degrees C target. If all pledges were fulfilled, there would still, if all pledges were fulfilled, there would still be an increase of close to 2.5 degrees C by 2100, according to Climate Action Tracker, for example. Moreover, few countries are on course even to meet their pledges. Very few have policies that Climate Action Tracker reckons are compatible with 2 degrees of warming. Apart from a drop in 2020 caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the world's greenhouse gas emissions are still growing, which is the paradox that we're trying to address as we think this through. Well, our notion, which comes really from classical political economy, is that it's difficult for governments to make decisions because the electorate tends to evaluate policy on inaccurate grounds, and in particular on selfish grounds of assuming that the policy will change, but everything else will not change. So a company that is exploiting workers, for example, responds to a regulation to protect worker rights by saying, well, if I protect worker rights and everybody else doesn't, then I'm going to get clobbered in the market because of increased costs. And in the case of decarbonization, the politics clearly focuses on the power of fossil fuel interests. We pick Australia as an example. Australia actually emits more greenhouse gas per capita than even the United States. And this is without counting the contribution it makes to climate change by exporting hundreds of millions of tons of coal every year. And Australia is a particularly poignant example because it happens to be very vulnerable itself to climate damage. It's a hot, dry climate, which is expected to become hotter and drier with global warming. In the summer of 2019 to 20, not very long ago, it experienced its worst ever fire season, in which 18.6 million hectares of Australia were burned. It is natural to think that when things get bad enough, our governments will eventually take action against climate change. Yet, though Australian fires were catastrophic, the Australian government took no action. And they took no action, although 2/3 of Australians favor a commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. So what's going on here? Why does Australia do so little? And this is intended to be read in the larger context of the politics of decarbonization in other countries such as the United States and also in the world as a whole. In the case of Australia, it's the power of the coal interests. Even while the fires burned, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said that he would not make what he called, using the word in exactly the opposite way to Pigou's, reckless cuts to the coal industry. Coal is the most damaging of fossil fuels, but it is Australia's second largest export, and it directly employs nearly 40,000 people. Those are the considerations that counted with the Australian government. So long as there are powerful interests opposed to controlling climate change, governments will not act as they should. Morality in itself will never be enough to motivate them. The only way we can achieve a satisfactory outcome is to make sure it is in no one's interest to oppose action. So this is the key point of the talk and the discussion today. This is what we should aim for. We should not ask anyone to sacrifice their interest for moral reasons. We can then harness the strong motive of self-interest to drive action on climate change. And this can be done. Climate change can be controlled in a way that requires no one to make a sacrifice, not even the owners of fossil fuel reserves or workers in coal mines. So this is the next part of the slides, and this is the sort of meat of the talk. And I'll see if I can persuade you that these points hold water. This may come as a surprise. The moral approach has been pursued for so long that we are used to thinking the current generation has to make a sacrifice for the sake of the future. But it's really not true. If you look carefully at the economic analysis, the benefit that's gained by bringing climate change under control is large enough that you can compensate everyone for the changes they have to make. It is true that this requires the politically very delicate question of distributing these benefits correctly. If we did make a sacrifice of our present consumption for the sake of cleaning up the air, the benefit would naturally accrue to people in the future. But we can transfer some of that benefit back in time to ourselves, enough to compensate us fully for the sacrifice we make and leave us at least as well off as before. In effect, future generations can be asked to pay for the cleanup done by the present generation. And the future generation will still emerge better off because they will inherit a smaller burden of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The World Climate Bank is basically an institution that's supposed to facilitate this type of transfer of resources. The feasibility of controlling greenhouse gas emissions without demanding a sacrifice is a conclusion of economic theory, and I'll just briefly sketch this argument here. We could talk about it some more if there are questions. Greenhouse gas emissions are what economists call an externality. When you burn fossil fuels by driving to the mall or heating or cooling your house with fossil fuel energy, and cause an emission of greenhouse gas, the gas spreads around the world and does harm everywhere over a very long stretch of time. All this harm is part of the cost of what you gain by burning the fuel. But you do not bear this cost. It is borne by all the people who suffer harm. So you do not take the full cost of your activity into account in deciding whether to do it. This, as a consequence, there's a particular sort of inefficiency in an economy with this kind of externality. And this externality is obviously not trivial. It's not a small question. It's a very, very big amount of economic value that's involved. According to standard economic theory, it is what is called a Pareto inefficiency. We wish Pareto hadn't poked his nose into it, but that's just the jargon of economics. What it means is that a situation is defined to be Pareto inefficient if it is possible, in principle, to change the allocation of resources in the economy so that at least one person ends up better off without anyone ending up worse off. According to standard theory, an externality such as greenhouse gas emissions normally makes our situation Pareto inefficient. Now, if you have inefficiency, if you correct the inefficiency, you move towards a frontier, and it's possible to have, if you're thinking about it in terms of economics 101, both guns and butter, or in this case, both a higher standard of living and an improved greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. And that translates into making at least one person better off without making anyone else worse off. This analysis implies that climate change can, in principle, be controlled in a way that makes no presently living person worse off. And leaves future generations with just as good resources as they would have had. In this sense, responding to climate change requires no sacrifice on anyone's part, or in the technical language of economics, there's no opportunity cost to it. And we explain below, I'm not sure I'll be able to get to that, but we do explain in the paper how a World Climate Bank can facilitate a no-sacrifice response. So our what we're trying to persuade you, but we know you're not, many of you aren't going to be like this and aren't going to be persuaded, and that's one of the things we want to talk about, that climate change should no longer ask people to make a sacrifice for the sake of the future, but should instead be constrained by the condition that it requires no sacrifice, the no sacrifice climate politics. Since controlling climate change will generate a lot of benefit, accepting this constraint still leaves a wide choice over the distribution of the surplus benefit. It can be used to make present people better off or to give better resources to future people, or both. We recommend adopting policies that respect the no sacrifice constraint as the most practical path to controlling climate change, despite two strong objections that we expect to be made to this constraint. The objections are, first, that it will leave the world with economic maldistribution, and second, that it will perpetuate injustice in the world. I want to talk about these two things, and perhaps at that point, well, let's see how much time I have. Maybe we can do a little bit on the World Climate Bank itself. But let's look at what John and I try to put forward on these two objections. Maldistribution first. It's natural to think that our policy on climate change should aim at the best possible result. In economics, this is called the first to best, okay? You want to get the optimum. This implies achieving the best distribution of wealth and income within generations and between generations. Well, we don't have the best distribution of wealth and income within generations and between generations. And that means that the no sacrifice constraint is going to prevent us from doing a whole lot to correct those maldistributions. Without the constraint, you could do better. You could maybe correct some of the inherited maldistribution. But if we're going to accept the no sacrifice constraint for the sake of political feasibility, you're going to have to also put up with the fact that the policy is not going to address maldistribution. That's the objection. Well, we have some responses to that, and it's this argument that I think is where I'm particularly interested in hearing your opinions. Several economists have argued that the best intergenerational distribution implies some transfer of well-being from the present generation to the future, in addition to the part of world income presently devoted to investment and technical change. I personally have never completely understood that, because I think there's a pretty good bet that future generations, unless we mess up completely, will have a somewhat higher standard of living than we do. But and let's hope maybe a more secure and peaceful and just society. But this is where we started. For almost 30 years, the present generation has been urged to make a sacrifice for the future by taking practical steps to limit greenhouse gas emissions and avert climate change. Economic models have been used to reinforce this appeal by showing that a sacrifice would lead to the best result. But this moral appeal has failed even to overcome the inertial and political obstacles to measures targeted specifically climate change. So we have a question where the best is being made the enemy of the good. What about intergenerational maldistribution? The world distribution of income is grossly unequal, which is plainly a very bad thing. So if we choose our climate change policy with the aim of producing the best result, the first best result, it will be one that involves some redistribution from better off to worse off people within the present generation. If, however, we impose the no sacrifice constraint on policy in order to achieve political feasibility, you're not going to be able to do that redistribution. So the world distribution of income under a no sacrifice constraint will end up worse than it would have been without one. But again, from our point of view, which is a combination of pragmatism and utilitarianism, pragmatism perhaps on my part and utilitarianism on John's, you can't help this, since governments representing the present better off people will not accept the sacrifice. The world is beset by many problems. Climate change is one, inequality is another. These problems do not all have to be solved together. In fact, I might make that stronger. I might say these problems cannot be solved together. We should not saddle our response to climate change with the additional task of correcting inequality. If we do, we shall end up with no successful response to either. If climate change were an important cause of inequality, it might be right to tackle the two problems together. But in John's, in my view, that's not true. The world's inequality results from centuries of unequal development and from colonialism. Climate change is a relatively recent development because of the scale on which emissions have grown in the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. And we had already huge global inequality before it occurred at all. The real choice is not between an effective climate change policy that respects the no sacrifice constraint and one that violates the constraint to improve the world distribution of income, but between a no sacrifice policy and no effective climate change policy at all. To sum up this part, and this is really, as I said, the heart of what I'm saying and what I'd like to hear your reactions to, the problem of maldistribution is serious, but the no sacrifice constraint is forced on us by political reality and the failure of the appeal to morality in and of itself. I have a little bit more to say about injustice. When you harm another person, you do them an injustice unless there's some exculpating circumstance, unless you do it in self-defense or with their consent, for example. Our emissions of greenhouse gas harm other people, and there are no exculpating circumstances, so they are unjust. If we adopt a no-sacrifice response to climate change, we are also having to accept the idea that you're not going to overcome this injustice. So it's the same objection that you might make to a policy of ending slavery by compensating the slaveholders. They did a bad thing, but you're actually rewarding them in the interests of a better social outcome. This no sacrifice constraint is like that. Those who emit greenhouse gas unjustly advantage themselves by their emission, inflicting harm on others. Under a no sacrifice policy, they're paid enough to make it worth their while to stop their emissions. So their unjust advantage is perpetuated. This is very hard to accept for many people. Who are the perpetrators? Most of the people who cause harm by emitting greenhouse gas are ordinary consumers of energy. But there are also some who knowingly cause harm on a very large scale and do everything they can to continue the injustice. These include leaders of the fossil fuel industry who tell lies about climate change and pay others to tell lies in order to preserve their unjust advantage. If you were going to go for justice, you'd want to punish these people, but under a no sacrifice policy, they will be rewarded. So there's again a question of the best versus the second best, or the best versus the good. If you think it's a good idea to decarbonize, maybe you have to give up the idea of just outcome for the perpetrators. This is perhaps the least palatable feature of a no sacrifice policy. It sticks in the gullet, but we have to swallow it. These people have the power to prevent us from controlling climate change. They hold us to ransom, and we have to pay. We're going to have to buy out the fossil fuel interests. But the great saving grace of this situation is that we have the resources to buy them out because of the inefficiency that's involved in the business as usual policy. This goes back to the point of my earlier discussion of the economics of climate change. Any losses that would result from correcting the externality can be fully compensated by a transfer of money or resources to the losers from those who gain. Let me just do this, perhaps this in one more slide, and then I think we'll just leave the World Climate Bank for discussion or for another time. For instance, suppose the correction is made by imposing a world carbon tax. This tax will reduce the value of fossil fuel reserves, perhaps in many cases to zero. The theory tells us that owners of shares in the reserves can be paid monetary compensation that's equal to the value lost. It's important, though, to keep in mind that we're talking about the compensation for the value of reserves in the sense of their true value, which is to say the value of the income that could be derived from using the fuel in the future. And that especially with the externality in place, that's not going to be the same as the market value of the shares. The market at present overvalues shares in fossil fuels. It apparently values them as though all the reserves will in due course be used. But we know that the world's reserves of fossil fuel are many times greater than can be used without causing catastrophic climate damage, which will destroy the economy that gives them value in the first place. Economic theory tells us owners of fossil fuel shares can be compensated for the true value of their shares, not for the present market value. They cannot and need not be compensated for having made a bad investment. Now, this leads to the part of the slides that are devoted to the problems of financing these transfers of real resources. Those are important questions, and John and I are very interested in them. But I think, given our time constraints, I would stop the formal presentation at this point in order to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion and questions. And if some of the questions lead back to the World Climate Bank, we can come back.
Well, Duncan, I wonder just to ask you to elaborate on the last point, because it seems to be your crux of it, and that is the idea of how practically you would compensate the emitters in a way. And I know in your paper, among other things, you say where you get the money is you borrow the money from the future, et cetera. But I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on how we're going to come up with money to compensate these people, and yet the people who want to cut down emissions are not going to be the payers. Well, the people who are doing the emissions are going to be the receivers of the funds. So I'm not quite clear on this core idea.
Well, I think you, maybe John wants to weigh in on this a little bit, but I think you explained it pretty well in the formulation of your question. Basically, the idea is that you take resources from conventional investments in the future, and that how you do that financially is not a trivial problem, but those resources are there. And you would say to yourself, well, gee, isn't that going to hurt future generations? Well, in and of itself, it would hurt future generations, but this is part of a package deal that is not just reducing investment in conventional productive facilities. It is also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So what the future gets is a packaged combination of less conventional investment, but less greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And the financing question is, how do you turn that, as you say, into a program that would make it look to the fossil fuel interests as though it was in their interests to support it?
Okay, next question.
Could I
Well, we'll
add
start
something?
with Richard.
I think John would like to say about that.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's just a little thing, but it's worth reminding you that if we have a carbon tax, so people have to pay for the cost of the external cost of their emissions, that carbon tax will itself raise a huge amount of revenue. And that revenue is available for compensating people for the harms they suffer from having to pay the carbon tax. So most of the compensation will come from the carbon tax itself. And this is very conventionally understood. Many of the carbon taxes that already are in the world have been put in place by making a promise of what's called recycling when the carbon tax is imposed. People have been, for example, in British Columbia, were persuaded to accept a carbon tax by the promise that the revenues would be paid back to them in various ways in order to make them benefit from the paying of the carbon tax. So only a part of it will have to come from the borrowing which will allow people in the future to compensate the present generation for paying the tax. Most of it will come from the present generation itself.
Okay, so Richard and then Pete.
So my question's along this line. My first question was along this line. If there's a big difference between the true value and the market value, then why would these people who were trying to prevent opposing climate change mitigation, why would they go along with it? Why would they change their opposition? So that's basically a question of whether you come up with an estimate of the difference between the true and the market value.
Well, I think this really gets into the heart of the political economy of the issue. Suppose that you put on a carbon tax without any redistribution or recycling of it. The carbon tax itself is going to bring the market value of the fossil fuel reserves into much closer in line with their social value. So to some degree, that's a premise that you credibly assert that we're going to decarbonize. If we're going to decarbonize, your reserves are going to be worth a lot less, but we will give you some money to make you feel better about that. That's the package political package that you'd want to try to put together.
You respond.
Can I say something? I think this is a serious worry, or I find this a serious worry. And it makes me see the value of the divestment movement, which is persuading a great many major institutions around the world to pull their investments out of the fossil fuel industries. Now, why would they do that? Well, actually, because they're a very bad investment. As Duncan explained, it seems at the moment as if fossil fuel shares are overvalued. They're valued as though all the reserves that the companies own will be able to be burnt. And they can't be. That's simply physically not possible given the physics of climate change. So the markets are overvaluing these things. And that means that the owners are hanging on in a bubble. If they buy shares, they're buying them, recognizing that they're overvalued and hoping to sell them before the bubble bursts. But a strong divestment movement can pop the bubble. And that's something that I very much hoped for. In order to be able to make it feasible to use our resources to buy out the fossil fuel interests, the fossil fuel interests, their bubble that they're living on at the moment, I think really does have to be popped. And it can be popped. It's an insecure position that they put themselves in, buying and selling overvalued stock. And we can we can force them to recognize the badness of their own investment.
Well, if you put it that way, you could also see that the compensation puts a floor under how far the shares will fall, which could be an appealing part of it. The other thing I would say, you know, some of this is going on even without a coordinated policy. Many smart people understand that we have to plan for a decarbonized future, and that in that decarbonized future, fossil fuel reserves are not going to be very valuable. And you're already seeing many adjustments of the economy and an investment in the light of that realization. But it's very imperfect because it's not coordinated, and there's no credible commitment of governments to make it happen.
So I wanted some feedback, and I had a few thoughts that we're going through here. I like the idea of presenting this in a way of, look, everybody's going to be no worse off than they are before. And I understand the negatives that you addressed and the rest of that. But the big assumption there, and the numbers weren't run, is that everyone will feel that they're no worse than before. And I think there are at least three groups that just covers just about everybody that are going to feel they're worse off than before. Richard talked about the emitters. They're going to feel like they've lost this big value. That's one thing. Then we've got kind of these imagined territories. The religious will feel that all the oil was there for God, and that this is another damn Republican thing. And Obama promised we could keep our doctors. Now we're saying we can keep our F-250 trucks, and they're just liars and trying to take over the world. And you can tell that because they're going to have another world association doing it. And then most powerfully, perhaps, are the consumers. I ran some numbers the other day, and if I just look at the kilowatt hours available to me from the solar panels I have on my roof, and the car sitting in my garage, and the propane that heats my cell, I have the equivalent of about 200 slaves working 8 hours a day for me. And I'm relatively, eco-sensitive and the rest of that, but offhand, I wouldn't want to give them all up. And so I think the average person is going to say, well, I like meat. I like the food production I've got. I like my car. I like to take a trip to Europe once a year. I like heating and cooling my home. There's a whole bunch of things where just the physics doesn't, where literally the change that needed isn't just an economist telling me it's going to be okay, but a change of the definition culturally of what it means to be better off. Better off is not necessarily 3 more Versace, something's hanging in the clothes. Better off is not oil despots like Putin and Khomeini and bin Salman, taking over the world. Anyhow, I think that until we change the definition of what it means to keep getting better, and if we're defining by kind of the world we live thing of more kilowatt hour equivalent slaves, we're not going to attach this. We're going to be the question is, how do we deal with a collapse and what comes after it if we can't somehow deal with that? So that's just a thought, and I'd love your telling me how I'm wrong.
Oh no, I think you put your finger exactly on the psychology and the political psychology that's behind it. But you do leave out one thing. The Earth as a geophysical system is not going to sit still for indefinite emission of greenhouse gases. What's going to happen if we don't do something to control the emission of greenhouse gases is that the climate damage will do it for us. Now, how does climate damage do it? Well, it does it in a pretty random and very inefficient way. But the climate damage is going to have to get bad enough to suppress greenhouse gas emissions. That's the other scenario. If the other scenario was, yes, we could keep flying to Europe, and we can keep eating meat, and we could do all that, and that's, of course, who wouldn't prefer that? But that's not the relevant choice. The relevant choice is that you're going to be living under levels of climate damage that suppress your ability to do those things.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I question whether we're smart enough as 8 billion self-interested people and governments, and I mean, look at the people in Congress to, I mean, it seems like there's a rational path of a soft landing, which is what we'd like to have happen. There's collapse and whatever comes out of that, and there's the whatever extinction we're going to face. I mean, those are three feasible alternatives, and I'm not sure that even with promoting, we can change the culture. Anyhow, we're in deep doo-doo, and I'm not sure how much the economics helps us.
Okay, Nancy.
I happened, after reading your thing, to look up what was going on in Australia. And I think it's heartening because Scott Morrison is out. Somebody named Albanese, I think, is in. They made big changes in the investment in things like the electric grid. They've started something that's very similar to a carbon tax as of July 1st. That will affect the coal mines. So it's heartening, I think. The other thing that I wondered about was, it seemed as though when I read about your bank, that the taxation that you proposed was regressive and the redeeming of the bonds would be inflationary in the long run. Is any of those true?
Well, I don't think that there's any reason that the bond finance has to be inflationary, because if the market raises the interest rate enough to crowd out other investment, conventional investment, total aggregate demand should stay more or less in balance. Now, the redistribution, I'm not sure why you perceive the World Climate Bank as having a regressive in the sense of putting more burden on people with lower incomes.
It didn't seem as though it would be progressive, let's say.
Well, no, because that's the no sacrifice principle in a way, right?
Okay.
But that's what we tried to address in those middle slides of saying, well, are you going to let the best be the enemy of the good?
John? Yeah.
Me? Yeah, can I just say something about Albanese? Because I too, like many Australians, were very hopeful as a result of the last election. Scott Morrison was kicked out and Albanese came in on promises of a new green policy. And as you say, he has created, he has done some improvements within Australia. A lot of the benefit, a lot of the reduction that there's supposed to be in American and Australian individual emissions is actually going to be done by offsetting, which involves a lot of planting of trees, and it's not clear that that's going to work. But the most serious thing about Albanese's policy is that he's still planning to increase coal production. This is absolutely extraordinary. He's planning to increase coal production, and this is not supposed to count against his green credentials, because Australia doesn't consider the burning of Australian coal as part of Australian emissions. It's producing something like 1 million tons of coal a day. And coal is by far the dirtiest fossil fuel. And that is an incredible amount. And it's going to be increased.
Other questions, comments, points? What do you think, Paul? You look like you're ready to say something.
I'm pretty mystified at this point. I think the possibilities are obviously there. These gentlemen know what they're doing, but the political reality, I think, is something that was just remarked. if in Australia they can push the problem over into some other place, they're happy to do it. It's a real test of Adam Smith, isn't it? That the benefit of the whole can be achieved in better ways by what seems to be selfish behavior. Yeah. I hope there's a paper that we can all study. I can't decipher it in just listening. It's impossible for my head.
Well, I think we sent you a sort of more popularized version of the paper, but you too do have a real paper. I think Lincoln has the paper, and I can send it around.
I think we should study it. It sounds
well, let's look at the other side of the coin. Is how did we dig this hole so deep to begin with? Did that happen purely by the invisible hand? No, it did not happen purely by the invisible hand. There was a huge concerted effort to intensify fossil fuel energy by subsidizing it, making it cheaper. That goes back to the 1920s and was particularly strong, has been particularly strong after the Second World War. So I'm not sure why there's an asymmetry between the idea that you can get yourself into the hole by policy, but you can't get yourself out of the hole by policy.
Arthur.
Yeah, my question goes back to what you said about the regressive nature of a carbon tax. It's clear that people at the lower end of economic stress, use more energy, they pay more for their energy, they're more dependent on it, longer commutes, diet and everything else. How do you take the regression nature out of it unless you actually make the carbon tax intentionally progressive? In which case it's not necessarily some people are just going to pay more for their carbon tax and other people are going to pay.
Well, as John pointed out in the British Columbia case, and I think this would be the way you would design it, you take revenues from the carbon tax and you distribute a big chunk of them along the lines of, say, the Alaskan oil, the way the Alaskan oil dividend is distributed, which is on a per capita basis. Now, if you redistribute on a per capita basis, that's quite progressive. Everybody gets the same check, no matter how big their income is.
It would be even more progressive if people with smaller income got a bigger check.
Yeah.
Well, you could do that. Actually, in the British Columbian case, I think they did try to do something along those lines. And I just had a student dissertation chapter that I read that shows that the impacts, as well as you can measure it, of the British Columbian tax is very favorable to the lowest quintile of the income distribution.
Lincoln, you had.
Oh, yes. I was going to ask if a World Climate Bank, I know you didn't have time to discuss the bank itself, but if the whole idea of a World Climate Bank is unpopular with a lot of people, just the fear of global government, can national banks achieve the same role, carry out the same benefit that the World Climate Bank would do?
Well, that's a very interesting question. We have these two big institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, which were set up after the Second World War in an effort to some degree, create a world credit facility. Sorry, okay, somebody else has picked it up. There's the politics, as far as I can tell, of that are that those institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, have in fact functioned basically as stalking horses for US national economic policy. And that is a governance question. But it means that the US is going to likely be very reluctant to have a World Climate Bank that has a governance structure that's more multilateral and perhaps in a sense more democratic. I think that's a big question. You're talking about very large amounts of money. So you're talking about an institution that is going to have a big presence and is going to have a lot of influence. And whenever you have a lot of money and big presence and a lot of influence, you have a lot of political pressure. So that is one of the hardest problems, I think, is how to figure out how you could structure that. It's not so hard to figure out how to structure it financially, but it's much harder to figure out how you structure it in terms of governance. Maybe, John, do you have any wisdom on that?
Oh, he's muted.
You're muted.
Oh, you're muted, John.
Yeah, the question was, could national central banks do the job? And I think they can't, because there needs to be investment everywhere in the world for decarbonization. And a lot of it will have to happen in countries, in poor countries, which simply don't have the capacity to borrow large amounts of money. They need a central institution supported by the most powerful economies in the world, which would be able to borrow on their behalf. So that's a simple reason why it has to be done at the level of an international organization.
Oh, I'm Pete. I'm going to go back. Go in the back here.
Yeah, sorry, I'm way back here. I'm Marcia, and I feel compelled to ask that, to respond to the question I think that the speaker asked him, how did we get into this, or how did we get started with this, or where did this all start? Well, we all know it's the Industrial Revolution, but beyond that, it's human beings who did this to us. We did it to ourselves. We could always argue that there were points in time, if not way back when, at least in the 50s, when, as you pointed out, we were aware that there was a major problem that we were creating. My issue ultimately is, even if we do figure out through mitigation and other methods, such as the World Bank, to get us out of the mess this time, there is no reason why we won't do it again, because whatever it is within the human nature to make this kind of a mess without planning ahead, which is really what the problem is. There was no thinking ahead, or if you thought ahead, you didn't want to follow your thoughts because it might mean your pocketbook would be addressed. So that's ultimately, I know it's beyond the scope of this discussion, but ultimately that is the question. If we survive this round, we might not survive the next round because we still have the poison in us that created this problem.
Marcia, I'm smiling a little bit at that. You know, economists are very arrogant people, and they're sure that they can give us practically anything. But I don't think we're arrogant enough to think that we can make human nature any less feckless or vulnerable to poor decisions than it is already. But you can solve some specific problems. You know, decarbonization is not a very different process than carbonization was to begin with.
Okay, Pete, Nancy, and also those of you who are on Zoom there, if you have questions, you know, you can speak up or raise your hand and I'll call you. And you, Pete and then Nancy.
I want to focus a little bit on the carbon tax piece of the proposal, because it strikes me that we should have had a carbon tax 10 years ago. I mean, before I had this mark in my life of cancer. So 15 years ago, I was thinking a carbon tax would be beautiful politically, because if you say if the US and the EU employed it, and you applied it at the border, so that a Chinese good coming in, if they didn't have it, would get marked up the implicit cost of the carbon tax, that would encourage them to invest in efficiency. It would encourage us to invest in efficiency as well. and it would probably have energy efficient investments made around the world for anybody who wanted to export. So it strikes me as an extremely efficient thing. You could sell it. You wouldn't have all these despots, oil-rich despots. The value of the reserves would go down on the rest of that. And so it seems to me like that piece, regardless of how you argue about who splits it up and whether it's a World Bank, just if the US did it and the EU did it, and any place else there was a lot of consumption, it should make an impact. And my question is, has anybody studied exactly why we don't have one yet? I mean, it's political, but is there a paper out there that says blame this lobbying and this concern about whatever? Are you aware of anything there?
Well, I think as far as U.S. and European politics go, quite a bit is known about the political pressures. I mean, we've gone through this particular period of American politics with supposedly Democratic senators like Manchin and Sinema playing exactly the spoiler role that you would expect them to play, right? I mean, that's pretty. That part of it is fairly transparent. In both cases, then you get into a pretty complicated issue. In the 1990s, there was a pretty good political consensus. I think people had in mind what happened with the ozone layer and the CFC impact on the ozone layer, which we did make, there was a pretty effective world policy to control that, actually. And I think many people thought, well, greenhouse gas emissions is a much bigger case, but it would play out pretty much the same way. There would be an international consensus. There would be some kind of taxation or regulation to get the greenhouse gas emissions down, and then the economy would have to adapt to that. Just exactly what went wrong in that, I think there is probably a great book to be written. One problem was that cap and trade, which on paper has many great abstract theoretical advantages, tended to steal the show from carbon taxation, which is much simpler. And it turned out that cap and trade, for example, Europe did make a claim to make a credible effort at cap and trade, but they wrote the cap and trade legislation with so many loopholes and so many ambiguities that the whole system is pretty close to collapse.
Can I add something? As you say, from a theoretical point of view, a carbon tax is an ideal sort of tax, whereas most taxes create inefficiency from the point of view of economic theory. A carbon tax improves the efficiency of the economy. So it's an interesting question why we don't already have carbon taxes everywhere. And there is some literature on this, why we don't have them. And I think you can see what's likely to happen. Although a carbon tax is an ideal tax once you've got it, instituting a carbon tax is in itself costly to all the people who are going to have to pay the tax. People don't like paying taxes. And so any proposal to increase a tax or impose a tax is going to meet political opposition. And that opposition has to be overcome by the process of recycling, by making sure that most of the people, at least, who pay the tax do not suffer as a result of paying the tax. They get compensation in some way or other. But if the people are going to believe that that will happen, they have to trust their government to some extent. And it turns out that the countries which have the highest carbon taxes in the world are generally the countries where the people trust their governments. The government makes a promise, we're going to impose a carbon tax, we'll compensate you by recycling the revenue. You've got to believe they'll do that. But most of us in countries where we don't trust our governments just think of that as a way of the government trying to persuade us to accept yet another tax. So that's the correlation. Where people trust their governments, there are more carbon taxes than where they don't.
Thanks.
Nancy, you had a question?
I was just, I seem to have read that banks are becoming more reluctant to make loans in the fossil fuel area. That I read something about stranded assets. Can we count on the banks to do anything in that direction?
Well, I think that's one important feature that of recent history that I was talking about, that even without a coordinated international policy and a credible commitment, as John was putting it, there's a growing consensus in society as a whole that you're going to have a decarbonized future, right? Now, if we don't know exactly how we're going to get there, we don't know exactly how it's going to work out, but if you believe that there's going to be a decarbonized future, you're going to be reluctant to buy the shares of Exxon or other fossil fuel reserve companies at very inflated prices. And if you're a bank, you're going to be very reluctant to lend them a whole bunch of money, in the hopes that they'll be around to repay it with interest. So sure, that is going on. And that may be in the end, the answer to Marcia's point, that we're not going to coordinate ourselves out of this hole. We're just going to stumble out of the hole the way human beings tend to do, by kind of improvising and kind of hoping for the best.
So do any of you on the Zoom have a comment or a question? Anybody want to say something? Bert, yeah, go ahead and unmute yourself, Bert.
Okay. I'm wondering, since to the last point that you made, there's already some action to cut lending to fossil fuel companies. There's already some action by investors to not invest so much. Can you think of ways to accelerate both of those processes so that you eliminate the bubble that you talked about?
Well, the biggest way that would accelerate it would be to create an extra cost, a premium, a penalty on burning fossil fuels. That would change the landscape and would greatly increase the credibility of the policy. Whether you do it with a carbon tax, or it's possible to do it with severe regulation, but for example, I remember Joe Stiglitz. I had a brief conversation with him a few years ago in which he said, we should just outlaw the burning of fossil fuels.
So Bert's a retired business management professor. So Bert, I'm very curious about your reaction to this. Can that work with businesses?
Yes, I think so. So far, I like what I've heard, and I think it can have a positive effects on business. I don't know if regulation is the way to do it, and I personally would be more interested in hearing about the World Bank that you have in mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Just a footnote to insert here. I recall, it's vague, but I believe at the federal and in the Texas and Florida state level, that legislation has been introduced, and I think in one case passed, that does not permit the state, like in its pension funds and things like that, to invest socially responsibility. So while there's a wind going this way, there's actually legislation going the other way.
Yeah. Okay, Richard.
So I agree that morality has been insufficient to make the changes that we need. And I'm concerned that it's insufficient to make the changes that you're proposing. And I'm curious if we're approaching a place where we see a shift in in the motivation to make these changes. And that shift is a shift from morality to fear. So I'm just seeing more and more of us being surrounded by things that make us afraid. And that's a fairly powerful force. And I'm just curious if you also see that.
Well, I'm sitting here in Vermont. I'm sitting here in Vermont. I don't know if you've seen any news about Vermont, but about half the state in the last 2 days has been underwater from very extreme rainfall. Sure, I mean, that's the other side of it that I was mentioning in response to the other question. The choice is not really, do we make a rational adjustment? Some adjustment's going to be made to suppress greenhouse gas emissions. I think the sooner people sort of get that through their heads, the better. And we can either do some of it ourselves, and maybe as human beings, we're not very good at that and we're going to mess it up. But to the degree we can do some of it ourselves, we're not just letting the blind forces of nature suppress greenhouse gas emissions through climate damage.
So I guess my comment is slightly related to that in the question, and I'm curious about the philosopher view of this is, I mean, in so many of these issues, you can explain them either by good versus evil, good people versus bad people, or ignorance versus understanding. And so, I mean, that's kind of partly underlying the moral argument. The moral argument is sort of based on the idea that bad things in the world happen because of evil people. And yet, you know, as a progressive, I'm more inclined to bad things happen in the world because of ignorance. I mean, so just what is your view of that, since this whole view of morality judgment being a center of policy options is so important in what you're proposing? What do you think?
John, I think that's addressed to you.
I think that's putting the question into grandiose fashion, actually. I think the explanation of the trouble we're in is the very straightforward economic one, which is that greenhouse gas is an externality. We don't pay for the damage that we cause. And this is, you know, what generally recognized as a failure of the operation of markets in ordinary ways. This just happens to be an extraordinarily big market failure, an extraordinarily big externality that it's very, very difficult to get on top of. But I don't think that we have to think of this as a battle of good versus evil or anything like that. It's just a matter of putting this unfortunate feature of the economy right.
I think you could make the argument that capitalism has thrived for 200 years on not paying for externalities.
Well, sure. I mean,
I mean, whether you're going abroad to get gold or grain or minerals or fertilizer or oil, we've had a wonderful ride by consuming non-renewables.
I think Marcia is,
yeah.
Right. Or Kate, you haven't had a question.
Seems like these externalities, in fact, do have impacts. We see the pollution impacts on health. We see the pollution impacts on the air we breathe. The pictures we look at compared now to 50 years ago, we don't see blue sky anymore. The impacts on the peace generating quality of nature. So there are things that are called externalities that we're not putting it into an economic formula, but they are in fact impacting us.
And then in our quest for gold and all those servants and all, there are real people who have died at the expense of our current lifestyle in other countries. So to me,
our own country.
and yes, very definitely. So we don't tend to look at that as much. Seems like it's out there. But anyway, these are impacts. They're not in the economic formula. And yes, they're not being accounted for in that formula. And here we are.
I think Duncan did say this at the beginning. I mean, he and we recognize that there is a moral problem. And when I said what we've got is something which is straightforwardly understood in economic theory as an externality, I overspoke, because we do know that our emissions of greenhouse gas are an injustice that we're doing to other people in the world. So this externality is also unjust. And one thing it would be nice to do is to correct that injustice. But actually, we think that it's more urgent to stop those emissions in one way or another, whether or not it's done by correcting the injustice. We should try to do that, but the moral aim of correcting it has actually not succeeded. And the result is that climate change is continuing to proceed apace, and we've got to stop it. And putting right the injustice is, I think, something that is needed, but can come second to stopping it.
That's a good point, is that focusing on climate change is a good handle for turning this around. It's something that politicians can actually maybe wrap their minds around, isn't one item. I tend to look at a broader picture, but that is one item that would in fact go rather to the heart of things.
I think Marcia has a.
I just want to make a quick observation. That is that I'm still concerned about, while we're fixing this problem, and I actually do believe that we'll find a way to fix it, I want us to start working on developing humankind in a direction that will not continue to do this. And there is a way to do that. It's not just morality or religion, which I think can be very important. It is us learning how to embrace all of our emotions. Quite frankly, we have the answer inside of us. And I really do believe that when we become aware of our fears, fear was mentioned, this is good, thank you, Richard, aware of our shame, aware of our sorrow, aware of our grief, there's a lot of things that we suppress that we need to feel. That's not just a freebie. It will change humankind, and it will change the way we respond to choices we make and how we respond to the world. That sounds like a pie in the sky, but I believe that that is the way to make the difference between what we do now and what we do in the next iteration. And so people need to start working on themselves, and there are ways to do that. And I think it's critical.
So we're coming close to the end. One other question from me. So if your plan is to go forward, can it go forward in pieces? I mean, if one has to have a whole international buy-in, obviously that's a major project. But do you see a path for instituting what you're proposing? What would be the most feasible path for this happening?
Well, I'd like to see a little more what I would call political entrepreneurship, exploring, trying to get a coalition of progressive and fossil fuel interests behind some proposals.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's, and that could happen both at a national and an international level. And if it became understood that that was sort of the pattern of what was going to happen, I think it would facilitate change quite a bit. Maybe that's.
Duncan, following up on that, what about progressive factions political factions, do you think, how hard will it be to sell this program to the left, the political left? Do you think that they're going
Well,
to
the political left, you know, if you're going to play coalitional politics, you're going to split both groups, aren't you? So you're going to have to find a fraction of the capitalist class and maybe even a fraction of the fossil fuel interests that you can interest in a deal. And that may split the progressives. I mean, there are already a number of issues splitting the progressives on this. For example, the one that is not, that clearly is problematic for progressives is the role of nuclear power in transition. That is very troubling to many people. I think if you get if you have a log jam, you want to get movement. If you want to get movement, then you have to break some eggs and make an omelet.
Uh-oh, now we're getting revolutionary. John, any last comments?
Well, yes, I think we have to build coalitions. And at the international level, the coalitions don't have to be very large because only a few countries most of the emissions in the world come from a relatively few countries. A coalition between China, the States, Europe, and Australia would do it. And of course, they can erect tariffs against the other countries who don't participate in whatever deal they come up with. So it's not, from an international point of view, a huge problem. Only a few actors need be involved.
Would you say that India is one of those actors that should be involved?
Sorry, who was that? Which?
India, role of India.
Oh, India. Yeah, no, India too. That's true.
I think the history of the last decade or last century shows the possibility of this sort of movement. In my lifetime, I've seen the situation changed where Japan was a friend and then an enemy and then a friend. And Russia similarly. In China, certainly. So these major shifts in alliances are shiftable almost immediately. It's incredible. As I was a kid, I can remember when we had bloc meetings where we were celebrating Russia, the Soviet Union, which had formerly been an absolute anathema. So that sort of thing can happen very fast. And I think we'll see that. We might not, I might not, but I think future generations are going to see that.
All right, maybe I'll give you the last word, Pete.
I just wanted to follow up on Richard's questions about fear. So this group of progressives is the easiest in the world to get worried about this. We have the luxury of worrying about, will we have enough money when we're 95? And we even have some people approaching 95 who can say the money will turn out okay. So it's the people who get out the next day and wonder whether they're going to get shot, whether their car is going to start in the US. The fear mongering has been very effective in all the opposed this. You know, the government's going to try to get you, they're going to take away your cars, they're going to take away your job. My question is, how do you take someone who's in this, that's needed to make up this 51% of the electorate in the US, how do you get some of them fearful about something that's going to happen tomorrow?
Well, it's a very good question, but I think it's important to remember that a lot of fear gets pumped up by what people are consuming in the media, and a lot of what that is money.
Yeah.
No, it's climate change. You know, the fear factor about what's happening right now.
in the media we consume.
In Texas, in New York. I mean, I see more talk and hear more talk about the problem, the huge issues with regards to climate change, and it starts happening right in everybody's backyard.
It's because of I think it'll be a motivator.
Because it happens to, it's happened right here in Santa Cruz, fires. Right now, my own home, we're looking at, more mitigation work because of my fear of fire. So to me, it's right here at home.
Well, you guys certainly gave us a lot to think about. Thank you so much for a well-reasoned argument.
Else. So thank you, Duncan. Thank you, John. We really appreciate your statement.
Well, thanks for the discussion and the reactions, which are very helpful.
Okay, and we'll send everybody a copy of the real paper too, and they can send back their comments.
Great. Right. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Lincoln, any? No, clothing. Okay, all right.
I'll see Link. John, maybe we can email a little bit about this. And
let's do that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
My question, reading about the bank.
Yes, Duncan, we should be in touch, but just now I'm going to go to bed. I've got a long drive to do tomorrow morning, and it's past my bedtime.
No, I think this is not a good time to have a chat.
Okay.
Have fun with your sailing in Scotland. Okay.